As Anthony said, I was a member of the Independent Commission, and I would like to thank him personally for his leadership, because I actually think what developed from that commission was actually a product which will have significant influence upon thinking and upon the provision of youth services and the provision of criminal justice, and the impact, therefore, that it has upon young people over, I think, a prolonged period of time. What I thought I'd do is in a sense, try and build on some of the comments that John Drew made, and try and explore some of those in respect of the ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers' work and its strategy. What I think you might see as I speak is a degree of symmetry between John Drew and myself, and for some people you might think that's somewhat surprising, that police officers will be talking around much more about diversion rather than incarceration, around education rather than punishment, and around development rather than telling people off. And that's not to say that there isn't a place for some of those things, for some punitive issues, because of course there is. But it shouldn't be, in my view, and in view of my colleagues, the first port of call. So the objectives that ACPO seeks to set out, as you would expect, are around preventing crime and reducing antisocial behaviour. We seek to actually develop a situation where there is greater confidence of young people and partners actually in the criminal justice agencies and partners alongside. We see as a key role in respect of that actually a wider social phenomenon and objective, which is that of reducing child poverty by concentrating on individuals who find themselves in the most deprived areas or disadvantaged circumstances and are therefore facing higher risk, because crime and antisocial behaviour is not proportionate. In fact, it's quite the contrary, and I'll give you some illustrations of that later. John talked about issues of effectively recession and the impact that recession might have upon us. I think we're facing some fairly acute circumstances, but in one sense one might say they can be an opportunity as well as a threat. Some time ago I did some work on young people and drugs. But frankly, to say that the landscape was confused would be an understatement. There were so many bodies funded from so many different quarters with so many different views, that's to make an outcome really quite difficult. So there is something about having an opportunity to regroup and to say, actually, what is it that we as a society want for our children and young people, and what's the best way of achieving that? There is no doubt that we are seeing a compounding effect of cuts to public services. So in my own world, I'm looking at a 20% cut in budget over the next few years. But in a sense, that underestimates the impact that is likely to take place, because the compounding effect of cuts to yachts, the compounding effect of diversion schemes being stopped, the compounding effect of a situation which sees previous liquid asset money placed into the system to allow me to do certain things, and that being removed means that in some of my boroughs here in London, £1 million of cash, not police money, is just being taken out of the system. Now that in itself represents a challenge, but also says to us that we have to think in a way differently. So as the landscape changes, as the landscape becomes clearer, what do we, as the leaders in this arena, do to address it? Well, the Children and Young Persons strategy, in a sense, mirrors many of the things, and there's no surprises here, that the Independent Commission articulated. So we see at the centre of this an opportunity to, yes, invest locally, but to engage and listen to young people more effectively, and that we seek to do that through all manner of means, whether that's voluntary police cadets, whether it's our youth independent advisory schemes, whether it's a Muslim independent advisory groups, whether it's actually just running surgeries out in our safer neighbourhoods. All manner of means, because what we, I think, have learned over the years is that a police service that doesn't engage, that doesn't listen, is a police service that becomes remote, and a police service that therefore becomes less effective than it can be. We also have at the centre of our strategy is to avoid the unnecessary criminalisation of young people, and we welcome the fact that we see reductions in first-time entrance into the criminal justice system. And we welcome, again, at the centre of our strategy is a commitment to restorative justice. And what's quite interesting is that actually what the public, I think, yearn for is early resolution, is actually seeing something that is proportionate to a young person, seeing something that is proportionate to the victim. And it seems to me that what the restorative justice system allows is for that proportionality to be witnessed, felt by victims of crime. We also have at the centre of our strategy an issue around early intervention. There are lots and lots of people who talk about early intervention and have talked about it for many years. There was a time when it was looked down on, in a sense, as, oh, this is social re-engineering. I think people have learned the lessons that this is not about social re-engineering, it's about opportunity to resolve problems that young people who are at risk might face, and that we can do that collectively. And here in London and across the UK, we are seeking to endeavour to draw and build on the opportunity that in a sense the recession gives us, to draw on the collective capability and say how are we going to work more effectively together. We've got to remember, it seems to me, that most young people are just good citizens. That actually very few could be described as recidivist. In fact, the statistics would say that actually only around about 6% of young people find themselves repeating offending. So early and proportionate intervention, it seems to me, is right and proper. And quite interestingly, when we look at the street level interventions of restorative justice, we find levels of satisfaction on both the victim and the offender in the high 80s and sometimes 90s. Now, these are incredible statistics. Why? Because it feels right. I don't believe that many people want to see young people waste their futures, and therefore something that comes in and actually stops reoffending early seems to me to be the right thing to do. Now, I'm not saying that custody is not appropriate in some cases, because it clearly is, but should be seen as a last resort, and should be seen when it is there actually as an opportunity to remodel, to reboot. Yesterday I went to a reception of the Wave Trust in Downing Street. In fact, Rena Sodhi, who's sat at the back there, the Chief Executive of the Safer London Foundation, was present as well. And what it seems to me is that there is now a surge, a wave, which we need to ride. That wave, I think, comes from a consensus which I think I'm picking up from things like the Independent Commission, like ACPO, like the Graham Allen review. When I speak to ministers, they all talk of the opportunity of early intervention. The fact is that when babies are born, they only have around about 25% of their brain developed. So the opportunity to influence that development in the early years seems to me to be right. There is a massive development in their first 3 years, so going from 25% to 80% in the first 3 years. Now you might say, well, you would want to influence there because actually young people who find themselves later abused at early years are more likely to find themselves abusers and victims in the future. There is work going on about the economic benefits of this, because I think we have to be realistic, and this is back to this sort of theme of opportunity that we have economically. As we look ahead, we can see a growing elderly population with a reducing young population that is actually providing for the economy. So actually there's a good business case to get good people out there working and offering benefit back. In Croydon, there was a study which looked at a population of 30,000 in a deprived area that suggested, and this is where it becomes quite difficult, that suggested that on a £2.5 million investment over 10 years you'd get a £25 million return. So restorative justice, early intervention, I think, common themes, engagement with young people, and actually looking at how we collectively draw our resources together. And I'd just like to share some statistics with you, which I think, in a sense, illustrate this issue of disproportionality and how it therefore offers an opportunity through something we call in London multi-agency safeguarding hubs. Now this started as an idea on the 10th floor of New Scotland Yard about 18 months ago, and has developed, and I'm very pleased to say has developed at a rate of knots, to such an extent that now we've got 14 boroughs in London who are signed up to this MASH scheme, which is central to the theme of the ACPO strategy. Essentially, it places out there the challenge of what do we do locally about these young people who are at greater risk. And it starts from a position, in a sense, of saying there are some more at risk than others. So let's be alive to that fact and concentrate. So the statistics I refer to, 4% of the population is estimated to suffer 40 to 44% of crime. Only 4% of the population. Here in London, only 2.5% of our geography accounts for 20% of our crime. 3% of London's streets suffer 30% of London's violence. And there is huge disproportionality, depends on where you go, which would suggest that as few as 10% of offenders are responsible for up to 50% of crime. These are called clues. Now, for us as agencies, we then, it seems to me, need to look across our various databases and say, okay, when and how and who are we going to concentrate on? And where will we get, to use a business phrase, the biggest return on investment? And how does our criminal justice system support those individuals to divert them away from what might be a very difficult life? So I summarise this as in the phrase joint, joint, joint. So let's spend some time thinking and understanding the problem in the first place. Themes identified in the Commission. Spend time to think. Then spend time to work jointly to deal with some of these issues. We know I have illustrations where, and I'll share one in a moment, where different agencies are concentrating in a disparate fashion, trying to come up with an answer to an individual who finds themselves under trying circumstances. If we were to jointly concentrate and work as a collective, which for me is part of the localism agenda and part of the opportunities that actually some of the issues of the Green Paper give us, it seems to me then we will be more effective, both to the individual and, of course, to society in general. And I'm going to tell you a story about a young person called Quincy. Actually, he's not so young now. He's in his 30s. We've produced a DVD with Quincy, which actually illustrates his life. And if I was to describe him, he's a member of the BME community, and I have a picture of him as part of this DVD. A beautiful 8-year-old. At 32, he was serving a 14-year sentence for turning a machine gun on police officers. Fortunately, he missed, but his friend didn't. Now, when you look back at Quincy, you see a series of interventions, of failed interventions. You see an individual who was abused mentally from an early age. You see an individual who was taught how to fight rather than to play football. You see an individual who's taught how to drug deal rather than maths. You see an individual who actually lost confidence and actually thought, I'm not worth anything. But interestingly, you see an individual who was frightened. Frightened almost by himself as well as his circumstances. I believe that Quincy, aged 8, could have been diverted. I believe that Quincy, as he went through his teenage years, had opportunity. And it seems to me that that opportunity is about organisations and communities coming together to identify Quincy's. I think we know who they are. I think the criminal justice system knows who they are. I think the challenge for us is to, as professionals and as communities, to take our responsibility. So what of the victim? And I'll finish on this. It seems to me that, in a sense, some might say, oh, well, Ian, what you've done is you've concentrated on the offender. So where's the victim in all of this? Well, let's just reflect upon the victim. Actually, I believe that being thoughtful is victim-friendly. Being proportionate is victim-friendly. Preventing reoccurrence of offending, diverting offenders away to prevent them offending again, is victim-friendly. Having valued members of society who add to the well-being of a community, who add to a broader society and who add value to that society, is victim-friendly. So it seems to me that concentrating in a collective and coherent way to repairing the individual who finds themselves as an offender, and remember what was said earlier, offenders and victims are two sides often of the same coin. Go back to our 4% of the population. Many of those will also find themselves as offenders. So by concentrating in a strategic way our resources, by taking the lessons, I think, from the Independent Commission, by taking the lessons from the Graham Allen Review, by listening to people like Maggie Atkinson, the Children's Commissioner, by getting organisations such as the Police Service keen to align themselves with other agencies through things like the multi-agency safeguarding hubs, it seems to me that we offer both the victim and the offender an opportunity, and that, it seems to me, is an objective worth having. Thank you.